The church bells rang faintly in the background, though the sound was drowned by the low murmur of laughter and whispers that carried through the small town hall. Every eye seemed to turn when she walked in, her frame taking up more space than the delicate, lace-trimmed dress allowed. She held her head high, but inside, her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. Her hands twisted together in front of her as if that might hide the trembling. She knew what they saw, not the softness of her eyes, not the warmth of her soul, but the roundness of her body, the heaviness she carried, and the society's verdict that she was unworthy of love. The sneers were quiet but sharp. "She's the bride," one whispered, stifling a laugh. "He must be desperate." Another giggled behind her hand, nudging her companion. "Imagine walking down the aisle looking like that." The words stung, though they weren't new. She had carried their weight as long as she had carried her body. Still, today was supposed to be different. Today she was supposed to feel chosen. Today was supposed to belong to her. Her groom stood near the altar, but his face was tight, his jaw clenched with embarrassment instead of pride. He didn't take her hand when she reached him. Instead, he leaned toward his best man and muttered something that made both of them smirk. Her stomach dropped, though she forced her lips into a trembling smile, because giving up would mean admitting what everyone already believed, that she didn't belong here. The ceremony moved forward in halting steps, but before vows could be exchanged, he stepped back. His voice was harsh, almost cruel, as he said, "I can't do this." Gasps echoed through the hall. She froze, unable to breathe as his words cut through her. "Look at her," he went on, his voice trembling with laughter he couldn't hide. "I can't marry someone like that." The humiliation burned hotter than tears. The room erupted with whispers, some pitying, most mocking. She turned to leave, her vision blurred, her legs shaky beneath the weight of ridicule. But before she could make it to the door, a small, clear voice pierced the noise. "She is pretty, Daddy." The words were soft, innocent, and yet they silenced the room. Heads turned to see the little girl, no older than 5, clutching her father's large hand. Her big brown eyes were fixed on the bride with an honesty adults no longer dared to hold. Her cowboy hat slipped crookedly over her curls as she tugged on her father's sleeve. "She looks like a princess." The cowboy, broad-shouldered, rugged, his hat shadowing eyes that had seen too much, looked down at his daughter, then up at the trembling bride. He didn't laugh. He didn't sneer. He saw the pain etched across her face, the way she fought to keep standing when every part of her wanted to run. He saw strength. He saw beauty. And for the first time in a long time, she felt seen. The little girl let go of her father's hand and ran to the bride, her tiny arms wrapping around the woman's skirt without hesitation. "Don't cry," she whispered, her small voice breaking against the silence of the hall. "You're pretty. You're my favorite." Tears fell then, not just hers but from eyes that had mocked moments earlier. The cowboy stepped forward, lifting his daughter gently into his arms. He tipped his hat back, meeting the bride's eyes with something steady, something unshaken. "She doesn't lie," he said quietly. "She knows beauty when she sees it." The hall fell into shameful silence. The groom shifted, his pride collapsing into embarrassment as the crowd's attention turned from the woman he had humiliated to the man and child who defended her without hesitation. And in that moment, as she stood bathed in the warmth of a child's pure honesty, the cruel laughter lost its power. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't less. She was, as the little girl had said, pretty. Pretty enough to be seen. Pretty enough to be loved. Pretty enough to matter. And for the first time in her life, she believed it. The bride's fingers tightened around the folds of her dress, clutching the fabric like a lifeline. She could feel the warmth of the little girl's embrace pressing into her legs, a comfort she didn't expect, a kindness she had never dared hope for in a room filled with ridicule. She swallowed hard, but the lump in her throat refused to disappear. When she finally found the courage to look at the cowboy again, she saw something in his eyes that made her chest ache, a steadiness, a gentleness that felt foreign in a place that had so often broken her. The groom had already turned his back, muttering something to his best man as if his rejection of her was a punchline to a cruel joke. He didn't even look at her, as though discarding her in front of everyone was no heavier than tossing away a scrap of paper. The sting of his rejection burned, but strangely, it wasn't what filled her chest in that moment. It was the little girl's unwavering smile, the small hands clutching her dress as though she were worth holding onto. Sweetheart, the cowboy murmured, lifting his daughter off the floor, maybe give her some space, But the child shook her head fiercely, clutching the bride's hand instead. No, Daddy. She's sad. She needs a friend. The bride's throat tightened, her heart splintering as the innocence of the words sank into her. She knelt slowly, the weight of her gown pooling around her knees, and met the girl's gaze. You're very kind, she whispered, her voice trembling. Thank you. The little girl beamed, as if she had just been told she was the queen of the world. She leaned closer and whispered as though sharing a secret meant only for the bride. Don't listen to them. My mama said people laugh when they're jealous. Daddy says real pretty is inside, and you have it. The bride's vision blurred. She couldn't stop the tears anymore, not after that. She pressed her hand gently against the child's cheek, marveling at how someone so small could carry so much truth in her words. The cowboy stepped closer, tipping his hat back, revealing eyes the color of the prairie after rain. Ma'am, he said quietly, voice carrying the rough edge of a man who worked with his hands, sometimes the hardest thing you'll ever do is keep standing tall when folks try to cut you down. But you've done just that. Don't let this break you. Her lips parted, but no words came. For so long she had been the object of ridicule, a silent figure enduring the jeers. To hear him speak to her as though she were worthy of respect, of strength, made something shift deep inside. The crowd had fallen into uneasy silence. Some looked ashamed, others curious, but most avoided her eyes, unwilling to face the reflection of their cruelty. The groom and his friends had already slipped out, unwilling to share the same air now that the spotlight had shifted. And in the sudden stillness, she realized she wasn't humiliated anymore. She was free. But freedom was a strange thing, liberating yet terrifying. The weight of the failed wedding pressed on her shoulders, the mocking whispers still echoing in her head. She wanted to flee, to find a place where no one could see her breaking. The cowboy must have sensed it because he shifted his daughter to one arm and extended his free hand toward her. Come on, he said softly. You don't need to stand here for them any longer. Her gaze fell to his hand, rough and calloused, yet offered without hesitation. A man like him, solid, steady, carrying the earth and sky in his very posture, was holding his hand out to her. For a heartbeat, she hesitated, afraid of what it meant. But then, without a word, she placed her trembling fingers in his, and he closed his hand gently around hers. The walk out of the hall felt endless, every step heavy with the weight of eyes. But she wasn't walking alone anymore. The little girl perched on his hip kept grinning at her, waving her small hand as if she were proud to be seen with her. And the cowboy kept her hand firmly in his, a silent shield against the world. Outside, the air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of wildflowers and dust. She inhaled deeply, as though she had been suffocating for years and could finally breathe again. She let go of his hand reluctantly, wrapping her arms around herself as though to contain all the emotions threatening to spill over. I'm sorry, she whispered, though she wasn't sure why. Perhaps for causing a scene, perhaps for existing, perhaps for letting others see her pain. You got nothing to be sorry for, the cowboy said firmly. His voice had the finality of truth, leaving no room for argument. You stood there with more dignity than any of them. She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping. Dignity. I was abandoned at the altar and laughed out of my own wedding. That's not dignity. That's humiliation. His eyes softened, though his jaw tightened. No, ma'am. Humiliation is what those folks ought to feel for the way they treated you. What you did. You stood in front of all of them, even when it hurt. That takes courage. Her chest ached with the force of his words. No one had ever called her courageous. No one had ever looked past her body long enough to see her heart. The little girl wriggled in his arms, leaning forward. Don't be sad, she said again, patting the bride's cheek with her tiny hand. You can come to our ranch. Daddy makes the best pancakes. The bride blinked, caught between laughter and tears. Pancakes. The child nodded with fierce conviction. With honey and butter. You'll like them. The cowboy chuckled low in his throat, adjusting his daughter's hat. She's persistent, I'll give her that. Then his gaze returned to the bride. She's right, though. You shouldn't be alone tonight. Come on back with us. It's a long ride, but the stars will be out, and the air will clear your head. She opened her mouth to refuse. She wanted to retreat into the safety of solitude, to nurse her wounds without witnesses. But when she looked into the little girl's hopeful face and the cowboy's steady eyes, the words died on her tongue. For once, someone wanted her, not in spite of who she was, but simply because she was. So she nodded, just once, and whispered, "All right." The journey to the ranch stretched before her like a lifeline. The hum of the truck engine, the child's chatter, the cowboy's quiet strength, it all wove around her like a blanket, softening the jagged edges of her broken heart. She didn't know what awaited her there, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid to find out. The truck rattled gently down the dirt road, headlights carving a path through the darkness. The world outside blurred into shades of gray and shadow, but inside the cab, everything was sharp, almost too real. She sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, still clutching at the torn lace of her dress as though it were armor. Every so often, her eyes darted to the little girl in the back seat, who hummed a tune only children seemed to know, her small boots swinging off the edge of the seat. The cowboy's hands rested steady on the wheel, broad and certain, his posture relaxed despite the long road ahead. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but heavy, weighted with the things none of them had yet spoken aloud. She wanted to say thank you, but the words stuck, tangled in her throat. She wanted to apologize again for intruding into their lives, but his earlier words, "You got nothing to be sorry for," still rang in her ears. The little girl leaned forward, her face peeking between the seats. "What's your name?" Her lips parted, caught off guard. "Anna," she said softly. "My name's Anna." The girl smiled, beaming as though she'd just been given a secret treasure. "Anna. That's pretty. Like a princess." Her chest tightened, warmth flooding her despite the ache of the day. "What's your name?" "Clara," the child answered proudly, puffing out her chest. "Clara May. But Daddy calls me Bug sometimes. Or Trouble." The cowboy chuckled low in his throat, a sound that seemed to rumble more than echo. "Trouble's about right." Clara giggled, clearly pleased. "What should I call you?" she asked Anna, eyes wide with sincerity. Anna hesitated, caught between laughter and tears again. "You can just call me Anna." Clara tilted her head, considering. "Okay. Anna," she whispered at once, as though testing the sound, then nodded with satisfaction. "You're pretty, Anna." Her throat closed, her vision blurring. She turned toward the window quickly, unwilling to let either of them see her cry again. Pretty. Such a simple word, yet it felt like a bomb pressed against years of wounds. She had heard the opposite more times than she could count. But from the lips of a child, spoken with no agenda, no cruelty, it felt truer than anything she'd ever been told. The cowboy's voice broke into her thoughts, low and steady. "She doesn't say things she doesn't mean. You best believe her." Anna turned back, surprised to find his eyes flicking toward her before settling on the road again. There was no teasing in his tone, no mockery. Just a quiet conviction that made her heart stutter. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was thanking him, his daughter, or both. The drive stretched long, but slowly, the silence softened into something almost comforting. Clara dozed off eventually, her head lolling to the side, her small hands still clutching the hem of her stuffed rabbit. The cowboy glanced into the mirror, then back at Anna. "Rough night," he said simply, not a question but an observation. She laughed bitterly, the sound foreign in her own ears. "That's one way to put it. You don't have to talk about it," he offered. "Sometimes it's better just to let the road take it away." She studied him, the rugged line of his jaw, the way the shadows danced across his face. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "You don't even know me." He didn't answer right away. His hands tightened on the wheel, the silence stretching as the hum of the engine filled the space. Finally, he said, "Because I know what it feels like to be laughed at when you're already hurtin'. And because he nodded toward Clara in the back, saw you first. That was enough for me." Anna blinked, her chest tightening again. He spoke so simply, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to treat her with dignity when no one else had. She wasn't used to it. She didn't know how to hold it. By the time the truck rolled up the long dirt drive, the stars were spread thick across the sky, a tapestry of silver against black. The ranch stretched out before them, a wide porch light glowing warm against the darkness, the silhouette of a barn standing sturdy against the horizon. It felt like stepping into another world, one untouched by cruel whispers and mocking laughter. The cowboy parked and cut the engine. For a moment, none of them moved. Clara stirred awake, rubbing her eyes. "We, home. Yeah, Bug," he murmured, smoothing her hair before climbing out. He opened Anna's door first, offering his hand to help her down. She hesitated only a second before taking it, the warmth of his grip steadying her as her feet hit the ground. Clara slipped her small hand into Anna's without hesitation, tugging her toward the house. "Come on, Anna. I'll show you my room. You can sleep in there if you want. It's got stars on the ceiling." Anna glanced at the cowboy, uncertain, but he only gave a small nod, his lips twitching as though holding back a smile. "She won't rest until you see it." Inside, the house smelled of cedar and something faintly sweet, maybe honey or warm bread. It was lived in, comfortable, every detail reflecting the life of a man raising a child alone. Boots lined the doorway, toys scattered across the rug, a half-finished puzzle on the table. Anna felt out of place in her ruined wedding gown, the lace stained and torn, the tiara crooked in her hair. But Clara looked at her as though she were the most natural fit in the room. Clara dragged her toward the bedroom, proudly showing off glow-in-the-dark stars taped across the ceiling, a collection of stuffed animals lined up on the bed like soldiers. "You can sleep here," she said firmly, climbing onto the bed. "I'll tell them to scoot over." Anna laughed softly despite the heaviness in her chest. "I don't want to take your bed." "You're not talkin' it," Clara argued. "We're sharing." Anna's eyes stung again, but before she could answer, the cowboy appeared in the doorway. "Bug, let Anna get settled. Why don't you help me make some cocoa?" Clara gasped as though he'd just offered her gold. "With marshmallows. With marshmallows." The girl hopped off the bed and scampered toward the kitchen, leaving Anna alone with him. He leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, studying her quietly. "You don't have to stay if you're uncomfortable," he said after a moment. "But you're welcome here as long as you need." Her lips trembled. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." He tipped his hat back, his gaze steady. "Sometimes just being is enough." The tears came then, hot and unstoppable, and she pressed her hands to her face, ashamed of breaking yet again. But before the shame could choke her, she felt the warmth of his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Not possessive, not pitying, just there. For the first time in years, she let herself lean into it. Into the kindness. Into the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as unworthy as the world had told her. That night stretched long and quiet, filled with Coco and Clara's chatter, the crackle of the fireplace, the comforting weight of silence when words ran out. And though her heart was still raw, still aching, something new began to root itself in the ashes of what she had lost. A fragile, trembling seed of hope. The days that followed her ruined wedding unfolded slowly, like dawn rising over the hills, not in a burst of light but in soft strokes of color that painted new meaning where there had once only been gray. At first, she awoke each morning with the weight of humiliation pressing down on her chest, the memory of laughter in that hall still sharp, still cutting. She would hear it in her dreams, see the smirk on her groom's face as he turned away, feel again the tremor of shame spreading through her as eyes burned holes in her back. Yet when she opened her eyes, she found herself in Clara's small room with its glow in the dark stars, the soft hum of ranch life drifting through the window, and the muffled sound of a cowboy's boots against the worn wooden floor. The nightmare lingered, but so did the comfort of this new place. It was impossible not to be drawn into Clara's orbit. The child seemed to sense when Anna's chest tightened, when tears threatened to fall, and would appear with an outstretched hand or a whispered reminder, "You're pretty, Anna." Sometimes she said it as if Anna might forget, other times as though she were reminding the world itself. She had a way of filling silence with laughter, her questions endless, her wonder contagious. With Clara, Anna forgot for fleeting moments that she had been abandoned, that her worth had been mocked. She's endless, her wonder contagious. With Clara, Anna forgot for fleeting moments that she had been abandoned, that her worth had been mocked. She could simply be. And then there was the cowboy. He moved through his days with a quiet steadiness that fascinated her. Each morning, before the sun cracked the horizon, she would hear him outside, the thud of hooves, the creak of the barn door, the low murmur of his voice as he spoke to the horses like they were old friends. He never spoke much about himself, not at first, but his presence filled the house like a solid beam holding up the roof. He didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. He didn't pity her or press her. He simply existed beside her in a way that felt both strange and safe. She began to notice the details, the way he rolled his sleeves up to his forearms when he worked, the streaks of dirt across his cheek that he never seemed to notice, the way his laughter came rarely but fully, deep and warm when Clara said something particularly clever. He wasn't polished or practiced like the men she had once tried to please, he was raw, unvarnished, real. And in his presence, she felt less like she had to hide. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the fields, Anna found herself standing on the porch, staring at the horizon. The weight of her ruined wedding still clung to her, but it had begun to shift into something else, something less suffocating. She heard the screen door creak, and then his footsteps joined hers. "Long day?" he asked, his voice low, his hat tipped back as he leaned against the railing beside her. "Long few weeks," she admitted, her arms wrapped around herself. He didn't push. He just waited. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know why I thought it would be different. I should have known better." They've always laughed. His jaw tightened. "That man's laughter says more about him than it ever will about you. A man worth having wouldn't have let go of your hand, not in a room full of people, not ever." Her throat ached. She turned to him, her voice trembling. "Do you really think I'm pretty? Or are you just saying that because your daughter?" He cut her off with a look, sharp and steady. "Anna, when I say something, I mean it. You are pretty. More than that, you're strong. And I reckon that's rarer than any beauty most folks chase after." Tears blurred her vision, but for once, they weren't born of shame. They were born of something fragile, something dangerous, hope. The ranch became her refuge, and slowly, she began to shed the skin of who she thought she was. She learned to help with the chores, though her hands blistered from the work. She found herself laughing with Clara as they fed the chickens, her dress catching in the mud, her hair tangled by the wind. She discovered a quiet joy in the rhythm of days shaped by sun and soil rather than the scorn of strangers. At night, when Clara was asleep, she and the cowboy would sometimes sit by the fire, the silence between them thick with unspoken things. He would tell her stories of the land, of storms that had nearly broken him, of the quiet strength it took to rebuild again and again. She listened, her own wounds echoing his words, finding in him a mirror of resilience. It was during one of those nights, the fire casting shadows across the room, that she finally asked the question that had burned inside her since that day in the hall. "Why didn't you laugh at me?" He turned to her slowly, his eyes steady. "Because I saw you." Her breath caught. Two simple words, yet they unraveled years of loneliness in her. To be seen, not for her size, not for her failures, not for the cruel labels others had given her, but for herself, was a gift she had never known. Time stretched, and what had begun as refuge became something deeper. Clara clung to her, weaving her into bedtime stories and morning routines. The cowboy's gaze lingered longer, his silences speaking louder than words. And Anna, once broken by rejection, began to stitch herself together with threads of belonging. The day she realized she had changed came unexpectedly. She was in town, the very place where whispers had once chased her down the aisle. She walked into the general store with Clara's small hand in hers, her heart thudding at the thought of familiar stares. And yes, eyes turned. Yes, whispers stirred. But then Clara tugged on her arm, looked up at her with fierce pride, and announced to a stranger, "This is Anna. She's my pretty friend." The stranger smiled politely, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that Anna didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. She stood tall, because Clara believed she was pretty, because the cowboy had told her she was strong, because somewhere along the way, she had begun to believe it herself. That evening, when she returned to the ranch, she found him fixing a broken fence post. She stood there watching him, the setting sun turning his hair to fire, his shoulders bending with effort. And in that moment, she understood. He wasn't just the man who had rescued her from humiliation. He was the man who had shown her what it meant to be seen, to be valued, to be wanted not despite her but because of who she was. Her heart pounded as she walked toward him, each step a decision, a defiance of every cruel word ever thrown at her. He looked up, surprised to see her standing there with her hands clenched and tears shining in her eyes. "I want to stay," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Not because I have nowhere else to go. But because this feels like home." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he set down his tools, wiped the sweat from his brow, and walked to her. His hand cupped her cheek, rough and gentle all at once. "Then stay," he said simply. "We'd be lucky to have you." The world tilted, reshaped itself around those words. And when Clara came running from the porch, her laughter echoing through the fields, Anna knew. She was no longer the bride laughed off, the woman discarded, the shadow of someone else's cruelty. She was Anna, pretty, strong, wanted. And for the first time, the story she carried wasn't about the man who had left her at the altar. It was about the cowboy and his daughter, who had picked her up when she was broken and told her she was enough.